okay?
It's called pseudologia.
You okay?
You constructively say.
Well, thank you for coming back to War and Empire. I see some familiar faces, and we're appreciative for every one of them, believe me, this morning. We're going to conclude the War and Empire Conference today, and we've got two more outstanding panels. And I think you would agree, those of you who saw the work yesterday that was done, the panels yesterday were outstanding, provocative, timely, historically, to use that word that was so in vogue back in the 90s, it had gravitas. There was a lot of interesting things to think about. So I'm so pleased that you're back this morning, and I'm going to go ahead, and I have no housekeeping to talk about, thank goodness. I'm going to go ahead and turn over to my colleague here at Grand Valley State University in the Political Science Department, Polly Diven, who will moderate this panel on the Cold War and Empire. And so, Polly, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Well, I hope there'll be just enough gravitas and not too much. I mean, I'm not sure that's something we want to strive for entirely. I'm not only moderating, but I'm going to participate in the panel this morning. I'm going to introduce the panel and give a little background to the Cold War and American Empire, and then we'll proceed down the table, and I'll finish off. It's clear that at the end of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, that the United States increased military and economic dominance. I think most of us understand that the powerful forces behind isolationism really had to admit defeat or look elsewhere for a rationale when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor in December 1941. By the end of World War II, it was clear that the U.S. was going to play a much larger organizing role and leading international politics. And I was thinking about a local angle like they do on the local news so much, and I thought, well, then the thing to do is really to talk about our local hero, one of our local heroes, I should say, Arthur Vandenberg, U.S. Senator from Grand Rapids, who really personified the movement from isolationism to internationalism in his, what they call sometimes, the speech heard around the world in the Senate chamber in December 1945, when Vandenberg announced his conversion from isolationism to internationalism in American politics. He'd been a fierce opponent of the League of Nations, and then he became a leader of the movement to ratify the United Nations, and as Senate Foreign Relations leader, he put together a bipartisan coalition during the Truman administration that supported such internationalist institutions as the UN, NATO, and the Marshall Plan. There is other evidence of American growing internationalism in the Cold War, and I know that you will hear more about that from myself and my colleagues on the panel. But clearly the participation in the Bretton Woods Conference, leading the way in the founding of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank were all evidence of that trend. I think because we're here at a conference on war and empire, I have to ask the question, is that evidence of empire building, or was that just a change in American policy? And I think the definition really varies with one's way, your answer to the question varies with the definition of empire you employ. I attended the debate last month between Victor David Hanson and Arianna Huffington, and you could see that they had kind of different perceptions of what an empire is. If we define empire broadly to indicate the ability to dominate international institutions and policy making, the ability I'm saying now, then I think the United States must be included. But if you adopt a more strict interpretation of empire to mean intentional building of empire and intentional and complete control of international areas, then the U.S. may or may not meet the criteria, and then you have a question of interpretation of history. But from my point of view anyway, the conference really doesn't matter whether we determine whether the United States was acting as an empire or not during any one period in history or the entire period of history. Rather, I think we have to talk about what has motivated U.S. foreign policy and why so many people in the world perceive us as having pursued empire. One of the earliest challenges to the United States that we are an empire came from the Soviets in 1963. A Soviet military text in that year argued that, and this is a quote, American imperialist circles were preparing to unleash different kinds of wars, including preventative war. So they saw preventative war as imperialist. The Soviet text further stated that the political aim of American imperialists were and still are to enslave economically and politically the European and other capitalist countries, and after the later are transformed into obedient tools to unify them in various military political blocs and groups directed against the socialist countries. The main aim of all this is to achieve U.S. world domination. So that's the charge from the Soviets in 1963, to which President Kennedy responded in June of 1963 in a commencement address at American University. He declared that the peace the United States sought was not a Pax Americana enforced on the whole world by American weapons of war. He, of course, said it was propaganda, and that baseless propaganda, and that the United States, as the world knows, Kennedy said, will never start a war. I'll just let that sink in for a minute. The panel assembled today will address the topic of American empire and the Cold War, and Ronald Steele, who had originally agreed to serve on the panel, could not come. I did want to mention that his Pax Americana has a little different spin on what an empire is or could be. In his 1967 volume by the title Pax Americana, he portrayed the U.S. as a benevolent empire. Wrote that the benevolent imperialism of Pax Americana is characterized by empire building for noble ends, and that rather than for such base motives as profit and influence. So, U.S. internationalism, and I'm avoiding empire here now when I say internationalism, is it benevolent, or was it motivated by what Steele calls base motives of profit and influence? I think you're going to understand my take on that before the morning is out. I should mention that Steele did moderate his thinking about Pax Americana in later versions of that book to be somewhat less naive about American benevolent empire. I also don't think we can start this panel without or at least introduce my own work, selfishly, without talking a little bit about the classic article by Jacob Viner, which every grad student that I never knew had to read, called Power versus Plenty, as Objectives in U.S. Foreign Policy in the 17th and 18th Century. In the 1948 publication, Viner asks a critical question: are states motivated by power or by economic gains? Although Viner specifically considers the impact of power and plenty on empires in earlier centuries than the Cold War, the questions he poses are really aptly applied to the Cold War and to modern day as well. He's just asking, are states doing what they do because they are interested in gaining power, or is it for domestic enrichment? He concludes that the two are not mutually exclusive and that states are generally driven by both power and plenty. So you hold on to that and remember that when we come back to my paper. Today I think we're going to have a range of views on the motivation behind American policy making during the Cold War, and also I think a range of views on the effects of U.S. internationalism on the Cold War. My own paper is going to be about foreign aid and how it is based on domestic economic priorities and national security objectives. But before I go further, I want to take the opportunity to introduce my fellow panel members. First, to my immediate left is David Hendrickson. He's a professor of political science at Colorado College. He's the author of 6 books, including American Founding in 2003 and The Imperial Temptation in 1992. Professor Hendrickson also spoke yesterday, I believe, in a panel on the American Founding. He's written articles for Foreign Affairs, National Interest, and the World Policy Journal. And today he's going to provide an overview for us of the U.S. Cold War policy. Next to him is Lieutenant General Josiah Bunting, a former Army officer who served with the 9th Infantry Division in Vietnam and, after that, taught history at West Point. Josiah Bunting served as the superintendent of his alma mater, the Virginia Military Institute, for 8 years. He is currently the chair of the National Civic Literacy Board and the president of the Harry Frank Guggenheim Foundation. He's the author of numerous books, including some fiction. I think some of the most well-known are The Lionheads in 1973, and an interesting volume, An Education for Our Times, which is about some ideas General Bunting has about recreating the American university. Today he's going to speak about George C. Marshall and the Marshall Plan. And on the very end we have Thomas Carty. He's the assistant professor of history at Springfield College in Massachusetts. He received his PhD from the University of Connecticut in 1999. He's the author of A Catholic in the White House, Religion, Politics, and John F. Kennedy's Presidential Campaign. In this book, he challenges the assumption that JFK's successful campaign for the presidency ended religious and political tension between Catholics and Protestants. You may remember Tom because he presented a paper here last November in the Religion and Politics Conference. And today he's going to talk to us about the Peace Corps. His paper is entitled The Moral Equivalent of War, the Peace Corps and U.S. Imperialism in the 1960s. So please join me in welcoming the panel.
Great title. Great title. Thank you.
Good morning, all. Well, I have been asked to talk about the general outlines of American policy during the Cold War, and we consider that question naturally against the backdrop of the present moment. Today, we're very much impressed at the great predominance that the United States enjoys in the international system. And so many authors have said, not since Rome has any one state had such a primary role in the international system. And it's useful to remember that people were saying exactly the same thing at the birth of the post-World War II order. In 1947, Harold Lasky said that America bestrides the world like a colossus, neither Rome at the height of its power, nor Great Britain in the period of its economic supremacy enjoyed an influence so direct, so profound, or so pervasive. So in a sense, we're back to this condition of great power, and we want to ask the question, what did America do with its power? What was the nature of the order that it created? And I think if one examines the dominant interpretations of America's America's Cold War policy, that there are three images that have been particularly important. One image visualized simply the nation making instrumental alliances with others to preserve its security and to defeat aggressive enemies. It emphasizes the intense nationalism and exceptionalism that animated the American people, and sees in American statecraft both the continual appeal of America's leaders to nationalist sentiments and the frequent resort to unilateral methods. The second image visualizes the post-war order as a kind of constitutional system, and with America as its leader. This interpretation stresses the multilateral and internationalist features of the post-World War II order, emphasizing that the United States deliberately embedded itself in international institutions that would serve the common good and operate on the basis of consensus, alliances that were not simply instrumental, but rather reflected common values and ideals. The third image sees the United States as an empire, with dependents, protectorates, satrapies, as having created a Pax Americana that spoke a language of cooperation, but invariably insisted on exercising dominance within its sphere. Those who would emphasize the imperial aspects of the post-war system may be hostile or friendly to it, though until recently the imputation of imperialism or the fact of empire was vigorously resented by nearly all of its friends. Now, if we are asked to choose which of these interpretations best gets at the real truth of the matter, I think that we have to first concede that all of them contain a certain degree of truth. None of them can simply be dismissed out of hand if we're to understand the contours of America's post-World War II order. America was nationalist in sentiment, internationalist in policy, and imperialistic sometimes in practice. Its people worshipped at the shrine of their nation, one whose destiny had frequently been understood in quasi-religious or millennial terms. Its leaders laid bare a vision of international order that projected a federative system joining allied nations in a common project for the defense of free government and the maintenance of the peace. And its unusual position of preeminence in the international system and its demonstrated willingness to use its power to enforce control often gave it, inevitably, an imperial cast. Now, let me now address the 5 aspects that informed America's policy to help us come to terms with this many-splendored thing. It does seem to me that one can summarize the basic aspects of American statecraft rather simply. The first commitment was to containment and deterrence. The United States historically rejected ideas of preventive war. As Harry Truman said in 1950, preventive war is the weapon of dictators, not of free democratic governments like the United States. Justice Robert Jackson, in a memorable speech at the Nuremberg trials, where he was chief prosecutor of the German war criminals, insisted that the United States, and as indeed the world community, renounced all ideas of aggressive or preventive war, that it was no longer a legitimate instrument of national policy. And that commitment was reflected in the United Nations Charter. The second aspect of American policy was the commitment to the balance of power. The American leaders did not speak in terms of seeking to achieve strategic superiority, but of rather in situations of strength that would prevent the Soviet Union from attaining to strategic superiority. There was certainly the idea that the free world might build up its forces so as to present to the Soviet Union a situation such that they could not think of profiting from aggression. But there was always very much the idea of American policy that at the end of the day we sought measures of arms control, that buildup was for the purpose of providing a common security for all nations and to limit the influence of arms. Third commitment was to international law. I think that aspect of the American commitment is somewhat difficult to recapture today. Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan noted in the 1980s that the loss of the American faith in international law was a very remarkable thing, and as he noted, by the 1980s it was the common view that real men did not cite Grotius, but real men did cite Grotius back in the 1940s and 1950s at the origins of the post-war order, and I think that was a very deep commitment among American leaders that gradually waned over the course of the Cold War, but was certainly very pronounced at the very outset. A fourth commitment of American policy was to state independence. American leaders accepted a plural international system in which a wide variety of actors had equal rights to the preservation of their own political system and to the prevention of aggression. In other words, you didn't have to be a democracy to claim the rights that all states had to be free from aggression. And as an instance of that, American leaders objected very strongly to the doctrine of national liberation that Khrushchev announced in 1960, finding that to be a real subversion of the fundamental bases of international order. Fifth commitment was to multilateralism. Now that changed over the course of the Cold War. The idea of multilateralism that existed in 1945 when the United Nations Charter was ratified changed. It soon became apparent that the Security Council would not perform the role that Roosevelt had foreseen for it as a guarantor of international peace and security, and the search then was on for international institutions that would register the consensus in international society but be beyond the reach of a Soviet veto. And of course the great instance of that was the North Atlantic Treaty. So those five commitments, I think, define America's post-Cold War policy. If we think about, normally we think about America's Cold War policy, of course, in relationship to the Soviet Union and then to other centers of communist power, such as Red China. But we can also think about it in relationship to the kind of tie the United States had with its principal allies. And if we think in those terms, it might be useful to distinguish between a near union and a far empire. A near union with the industrialized democracies of Western Europe, to which Japan was later added, and which included Australia, New Zealand, and a few other like-minded countries, and which was distinguished by very close consultation and accommodation. Now, it's true that America had the leadership role in those alliances, and it didn't exactly accord a veto to allies over certainly all aspects of America's Cold War policy, but there was a kind of veto, certainly in Western Europe, with regard to the kind of measures that NATO might undertake vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The United States listened, paid attention to the views of allies, sought to develop a common policy on the basis of consultation and close coordination. And my own view is that that very close relationship that came to exist with both Western Europe and Japan really grew out to a very considerable degree of America's own historic experience with federal union. The experience of America in the 18th and 19th century reflected a view that Republican states had to cooperate closely with one another, otherwise they would find themselves in a kind of anarchical state of nature. So if you were searching for a kind of middle path between the danger of universal empire on the one hand and the danger of international anarchy on the other, you had to form a union. And if you wanted peace, you had to submit to law. If you wanted to make that union work, you had to create institutions that would register the voices of allied nations and find some sort of mechanism for representation and the fair sharing of burdens. And that aspiration, I think, very much did underlie the great achievement of American policy in the post-World War II period, which was the creation of these common Western institutions. Yet, as I say, there was a far empire, and I think that that's not an inappropriate term to use to characterize America's relations with various weak dependents in the Third World. The United States intervened to install the Shah of Iran in the 1950s. It intervened to overthrow the Arbenz government in Guatemala and paving the way for rule by the generals. It overthrew Diem in Vietnam in 1963, which was really the moment of no return in terms of deepening American involvement in the war. It's useful to think about the impact of Vietnam on the overall contours of American policy, because it did have, it was in a sense the great failure of America's post-World War II policy, showing the limitations of containment. American policymakers held in their mind's eye this vision of aggression that had occurred in Europe in the 1930s and sought to apply those categories to Southeast Asia, and it turned out that was the worst possible venue to apply those categories because in broad measure the Vietnamese saw themselves as fighting for their independence against a foreign occupier, and the dynamics of the conflict almost doomed the American effort. So great conclusions were drawn from the Vietnam experience. Certainly it led to, among the American public, a skittishness about any kind of repetition of the Vietnam experience. It also had a very devastating effect on the perceived legitimacy of American policy. And in the aftermath of Vietnam, the old idea that it was enough if the United States committed itself to the prevention of aggression, that declined in importance. And there was a growing emphasis on the promotion of human rights and democracy. One can see this particularly in the movement of congressional Democrats to put human rights at the forefront of American policy in 1975, and much of their critique was accepted by Secretary of State Kissinger. Then on again to the Carter administration, which made human rights its centerpiece, and the Reagan administration, which made the promotion of democracy and the overthrow of communist regimes central to its policy. And there was a kind of logic by which that's worked out. The United States, before Vietnam, did not really have a particularly bad conscience about supporting autocratic regimes. It was the responsibility of the people of those territories to decide their own form of government. Kennedy, in the speech that Polly mentioned, spoke of a plural international system. I mean, a world in which states were free to choose their own form of government, their own way of life. It was not for us that they are choosing, even though they might choose forms that we would disagree with, said Kennedy. But in the practical circumstances of the Cold War, it was difficult to deny that the United States actually exerted a great deal of influence over various weak countries. There were many locales in which the American ambassador was the most important man in the country. And the critique that arose on the left, and increasingly among many moderates as well, is that we needed to really wash our hands of these governments or try to reform them. But if you tried to reform your friends, that resulted, as the Reagan administration pointed out, in an odd situation in which you were punishing just your friendly guys and being, conciliatory towards your real adversaries, the communists. And I think that conjunction of reasoning ultimately produced a kind of new consensus in the 1980s, which is that America would stand against both dictatorships of the right and the left. And that increasingly became the hallmark of the Reagan administration's policy and the new consensus of American policy, which survived the end of the Cold War. Now, let me sum up. We want to assess America's foreign Cold War policy partly in the light of where we stand today. And the question does arise, is the Bush administration and their strategic doctrine typical, a kind of logical unfolding of the past, or does it represent something revolutionary and something radically new? And that's a difficult question to answer. There are precedents for the things that the Bush administration has done. The Bush administration did not create the military-industrial complex. It did not create a situation in which the president had very large prerogatives in foreign policy, far greater than those which presidents had previously exercised. Nevertheless, there are some very dramatic contrasts. In embracing the doctrine of preventive war, the Bush administration rejected those Cold War policies of containment and deterrence. That's a very fundamental change. In embracing a kind of unilateralism, I think there's also a very significant change, although, as I say, the United States never really gave the United Nations Security Council a veto over its actions during the Cold War. Nevertheless, in certain aspects, there's been a real shift. Certainly, if you look at some of the things the Bush administration said in its first term, it's kind of come back to a greater emphasis on coalition building in its second. There's also a shift from the support for state independence and the prevention of aggression to the notion that the promotion of democracy is, even through force, is justified, which is not something that Truman or Eisenhower or Kennedy would have accepted, but which, as I say, became increasingly accepted in the second phase of the Cold War. And I think there's been a change also with regard to the degree of respect that the United States pays to international law. So perhaps one could summarize the significance of the Bush administration by saying that a great many presidents prepared the base camp for the ascent that Bush would make, but no one before him had gone as far up the mountain. Thank you.
Good morning, and I wonder how many people here this morning know that the Nobel Prize for Peace has been, the new Nobel laureates have been selected. It is the International Atomic Energy Commission, who will receive the Nobel Peace Prize at Stockholm this fall. The reason I mention that is that the person whose name has been applied to the Plan for European Recovery in 1947, George Marshall, was also honored 6 years later by the Nobel Committee in Stockholm, when Marshall became the only soldier up until that time to have been given the Nobel Peace Prize. I also appreciate Polly drawing our attention to Arthur Vandenberg, an extraordinary man of whom I'm certain everyone in Grand Rapids is proud. In a way, he is a human symbol for the transformation of the ideals, or rather the policies that the United States adopted in the years between 1945 and 1950. That is to say, he grew. He saw that what America had done in 1919 could never be repeated, that the United States was a player, an important player, the important player in the world. Some months ago, I watched a documentary film in New York City called The American Ruling Class. The producer of the film was a man called Lewis Lapham, the editor of Harper's. The film was a kind of a satirical send-up of the ruling elites of the United States, or at least those elites that think they are ruling the United States: commercial, cultural, political, diplomatic, and military. And afterwards, there was an open discussion among members of the audience with Mr. Lapham and others who had been in the film. A man stood up and wondered, did we ever have a ruling class in the United States? And if we did, was there ever a ruling class that was admirable? Admirable in the sense of wise and disinterested. This, of course, is a loaded question in every conceivable way, but it was not asked in that spirit. It was asked in a rather mournful and sad way. One thought of Matthew Arnold's line in Dover Beach: "The sea of faith was once too at the full, but now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar." I infer the questioner didn't so much mean ruling class as he meant a number of men and women educated to the usages of leadership, civic and political, whose earned wisdom was of the kind that inspired trust in the country, and whose character, publicly known, was the guarantor of that trust, and who, while neither professional politicians nor career government officials, served in offices of state when asked, and did it quietly and nobly, and then retired and did not write memoirs. Was there a time, he asked, when we had that? A voice behind me said casually, yes, the Marshall Plan, that was the last time we had that. Well, I do not propose to enter into a discussion, a prosopographical discussion of the best and the brightest, or the wise man, or In the Time of the Americans, one of those kinds of books about contemporaries joined in a common enterprise. But it is the fashion nowadays, surely, to condescend to any such notion of wise men like these. Of course, that was before women played a prominent role in the making and implementation of American foreign policy. But one English historian called the generation of Marshall, whose tribunes were all born about 1880 or 1890, the ablest in American history since the founding generation. Its names are familiar to you and need no recitation. One is struck, looking at this cohort, by certain qualities of wisdom and judgment present in their statements and speeches. They do not seem clever or smart, but rather wise in counsel, of intellectual equanimity, of an unpartisan and non-ideological kind. One is struck also by their autonomy, by the uncalculated tenor of their labors and their counsel. They seemed unmoved by the consequences to themselves of what they are proposing and arguing. The summa of this group was Marshall himself, just as he had been for the American army that defeated Hitler in Japan, the embodiment of schooled rectitude and selflessness. Well, here is a letter to the New York Times dated 12 September 2005. Quote, "What the country needs now is another Marshall Plan to rebuild all of the poor neighborhoods in this country. America has rebuilt a great portion of the world. It is now time for us to give poor people adequate housing, schools, medical facilities, and give them their dignity." Marshall lives in the American memory mainly as the first word of a two-word phrase, a slipshod synonym for unstinting national generosity. The United States, moved by compassion and a sense of moral obligation, is to use its treasury to provide whatever substance is needed to enable those in the world or at home to assuage that need. It is extraordinary how often this phrase has recurred in the last 4 or 5 weeks in the context not only of Afghanistan and Palestine and Iraq and the whole Middle East generally, but as a richly charged description of what will fix the situation after the Gulf hurricanes. Let me say something first of all about Marshall himself and the dense mix of circumstance that led to the European Recovery Plan that bears his name. The name itself, of course, applied at the insistence of Harry Truman. He believed that putting Marshall's name on it would associate the proposal with an unpartisan effort to serve the national interest, and that Marshall's rectitude and humility and wisdom would clothe the plan in a kind of disinterested righteousness. He was, as Churchill called him, quote, "the noblest Roman of them all." But actually, Marshall was an artifact of his own contrivance, a soldier who had made his life in rigid obedience to ideals more familiar to the 19th than the 20th centuries. This mastery of self, this capacity for sound judgment and practical wisdom, had led him to the highest positions in the military and had culminated in his appointment as Chief of Staff or head of the Army in World War II. He organized and built the force and was its strategic inspiration and overseer, the identifier and appointer of nearly all of its most senior generals in World War II, with the exception of Douglas MacArthur, and a fearsomely direct, if also respectful, advisor to President Roosevelt. Truman called him the Great One of the Age and appointed him Secretary of State early in 1947. By then, Marshall was admired and even venerated by many people around the world. Churchill insisted that, quote, "succeeding generations not be allowed to forget his example." But of course, they have. They have forgotten him, and they have forgotten most of his example. I was in a Borders bookstore in Raleigh, North Carolina, 2 weeks ago, and I walked over to the history section and over to the military history section, and I took out a book by John Keegan called The Mask of Command. And I idly looked through the index, which lists 110 field marshals and generals in Western history. Marshall's name is not among them. Marshall is somehow perceived as a kind of a piece of distant statuary representing nobility or something, but no one really knows much about him, and there is a whole family of reasons for that, which we don't have time to go into now. Well, just a year earlier, in February 1946, Averell Harriman, outgoing ambassador to Russia, could assure his own country that, quote, "Russia does not want war with the United States and is trying to cut off avenues of invasion by surrounding herself with friendly small countries. If we both adopt the attitude of live and let live as to our eternal affairs, and if we both respect the right of all people to choose their own way of life, this barrier between us should not be insurmountable." There was still that kind of hopeful rhetoric in the air as late as February and March 1946. But within 10 months, such hopeful notions, unrealistic notions, had lost any link whatever that they might have had with any reality. The Truman Doctrine had been proclaimed in March 1947, the United States agreeing to commit $400 million to sustain Turkey and Greece in their struggle to keep the countries from falling to communist-led guerrillas. And it was also about that time that the adjective falling began to appear in the vocabulary of American foreign policy. Country X, country Y, they may fall if we don't do what is necessary. Fall meaning falling to the communists. We had done so simply because the British could no longer meet their own obligations abroad or at home. The worst winter in a century had occurred. The post-war conditions in Germany and Italy and France in particular all had led various states and War Department students of Europe, and among them Walter Lippmann, George Kennan, Will Clayton, and Dean Acheson, to identify European needs that, if they were not somehow addressed, would lead to chaos and conceivably successful efforts dictated by the Soviets to exploit those needs. Marshall himself became convinced that those assessments were accurate ones. Well, victory has many fathers, as the saying goes, and defeat is always an orphan. The various initiatives that coalesced and formed themselves and were made into a coherent program approved by Congress and by their European beneficiaries are known to us as the Marshall Plan. The public announcement of that plan was made on June 5th, 1947, as part of the commencement exercises at Harvard, where Marshall and others, including T.S. Eliot and Omar Bradley, had just received honorary degrees. Marshall's friend and colleague and Undersecretary of State Dean Acheson warned Marshall, this is not a good place to make a public announcement of a plan like this, not because Harvard is not a great invisible university, but simply because no one pays any attention to commencement oratory, particularly the undergraduates and members of the faculty and administration. But it would appear that this is what Marshall, in fact, wanted. Such a speech by an American Secretary of State would be attended to, but quietly and not in a flashy, urgent way. It would make its way, it would disseminate itself in the world. Ideas and early drafting help were provided, but the language of the speech, about 960 words, an 8-minute speech, and the characteristics of delivery were purely Marshall. This is a man whose only charisma is the charisma of competence and function. The speech had all the romance, to quote a comment on Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, all the romance of a bill of lading. But like all the greatest speeches in our history, it was the pure reflection of a deeply meditated conviction. Sincerity is only rarely counterfeitable, and sincerity and in rhetoric, the most important element, of course, is that kind of sincerity. Marshall delivered his remarks in a husky, uninflected voice, and to give you a tonal sense, I want to read you a sentence or two from it. Consider the opening sentence, and remember that at that time Harvard was an all-male school. I need not tell you, gentlemen, that the world situation is very serious. But its burden is borne chiefly in these statements. Quote, our policy is not directed against any country or doctrine, but against danger, poverty, desperation, and chaos. The initiative, I think, must come from Europe. The role of this country should consist merely of friendly aid in the drafting of the program and of later support for such a program so far as it may be practical for us to do so. In other words, we understand the desperation of your situation. We'd like to help so far as our resources will let us, but we want the initiative to be yours, and we are hopeful that we can work together, all the European states who might benefit, including the Soviet Union, incidentally, in Marshall's opening calculus, in preparing such a request. This was workmanlike. There was no grace note, no filigree of ingratiating oratory. The British Foreign Secretary, Ernest Bevin, the next morning, one of the great unheralded heroes of that period, almost immediately saluted it, quote, as one of the greatest speeches in the history of the world. It's got to make you feel good if you're a commencement speaker to have someone say that the next morning. And the program that it catalyzed into being over many months, the Plan for European Recovery, would be saluted by Churchill as, quote, the most unsorted act in history. Its net disbursement over the next 3 years in credits, goods, and grants was about 13.5 billion altogether. In today's dollars, between 90 and 95 billions. Approximately 40% of what is being asked for relief for the Gulf states. But it was given very much in the spirit of priming the pump, not of paying for everything. We would be a helpful enabler and counselor, not a rich uncle. And though it was unsorted, it was not completely disinterested, for there could be no stronger bulwark against communism than a vibrant Western European economy. And it was to Marshall, in another important way, that the program looked for its success in approval, because no American of his time, or perhaps any time, was a more persuasive advocate or witness before Congress than Marshall had been. He was trusted by all, even by those who disagreed with him or doubted him. Quote, he always sought the national interest. Well, I will conclude there with this observation that since we began these discussions yesterday, there has been an almost invariable tilt in our minds towards the state of the world today, how we make foreign policy in the year 2005, how we spend money, those kinds of things. And I simply wish to assert this, that the promiscuous and slipshod use of the word Marshall Plan for American generosity is not helpful. That the plan itself was very carefully crafted and calculated. It was anything but a giveaway program. And the results within 5 or 6 years, leading to the formation of the NATO alliance and everything else, fully and richly justified the amount expended in its behalf. Thank you very much.
Can I use this microphone, or can people hear me without the microphone? Perhaps I've been doing too much research on John Kennedy, and if you're familiar with his physical ailments, and I've been suffering now with a back problem of my own, so thank you for listening to me from a seated position. I don't have the medical team that John Kennedy had. I understand that he had a lot more medical assistance than I do, but I do have a lot of people here that helped me out. I want to thank the Hauenstein Center Fellows in particular, and Melissa and Mandy and Kimberly and Brian, who's taken me back and forth everywhere, and Kathy and of course Gleaves, who have taken great care of me here. So I felt very comfortable despite the physical challenges. So I'm sure to go home. I hope I'm going home a little bit better physically, but definitely in better spirits than when I came out here. I want to thank you all for coming too. I probably will quote Kennedy, and I'll try not to lapse too much into a Boston accent. I was born in Boston, but I grew up in Connecticut, so of course I don't have an accent. Right? Right? Isn't that true? No, but if just in case you're not familiar with it, of course Boston is Boston, and Star Market would be Star Market, right? And Harvard Yard, and so you're familiar with this. In fact, Kennedy on the campaign trail was out in farm country, and he was speaking to farmers, and he said, the problem with the farmers today, do you know what the problem with the farmers today is? And somebody responded in the crowd, sort of a puckish person in the crowd said, yes, they're starving. So they pretty much quickly picked up on the Kennedy accent. But today I'll be talking about the moral equivalent of war, the Peace Corps, and U.S. imperialism in the 1960s. So at a conference on war and empire, the Peace Corps may seem out of place. What does the Peace Corps have to do with war? The use of the word peace implies virtues in direct opposition to military force. Volunteers presumably act as diplomats abroad without any obligation to kill enemy combatants. The spirit of international cooperation, which characterizes the Peace Corps, contradicts the breakdown of diplomacy that results in war. Yet the inclusion of the word corps does invoke a martial theme, and the Peace Corps also emerged in the context of a Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations battled for the hearts and minds and sometimes territory of Europeans, Asians, Latin Americans, and Africans. Well, how about empire? Can the Peace Corps possibly reveal imperial ambitions from the United States? Peace Corps volunteers served at the host country's request, and they could not act as an occupying force. Yet, as British and French colonies gained independence, the Peace Corps perpetuated some of the educational and technological programs that religious missionaries and colonial officials had previously promoted. U.S. volunteers abroad could disrupt foreign economies, cultures, and politics. Opponents of American military operations viewed the Peace Corps as hypocritical at best and intrusive at worst. So despite the Peace Corps' seemingly benign and humanitarian character, this presentation will demonstrate how the organization advanced American imperialism during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. Now, this paper defines the term empire as a government that seeks to impose a particular socioeconomic system on other nations. By using this definition, I will show that the Peace Corps did not replicate previous incarnations of U.S. empire. Thus, the Peace Corps did not conform to 19th century imperial dreams of manifest destiny motivated by religious imperative. Neither did the Peace Corps support President Woodrow Wilson's early 20th century attempt to export America's democratic political system. Yet the Peace Corps did serve the imperial ambitions of 1960s Presidents John Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson, who sought to fight communism by remaking the educational and financial institutions of foreign nations. So by characterizing empire as exporting a particular social and economic order abroad, I argue that the Peace Corps does not sustain 19th century imperialism based on a Christian duty to civilize the Western Hemisphere. Pressure mounted on politicians in the 1800s to fulfill this Protestant nation's manifest destiny of spreading Reformed Christianity and liberty. The 1840s all-Mexican movement pressured President James Polk to remove heathen Indians and Catholic Mexicans from the territory south and west of Texas. And President William McKinley's decision to annex and quote-unquote Christianize the Philippines after a U.S. victory over Spain and a night of prayer came amidst Protestant publications that encouraged ministers to serve as recruiting officers for this war and as missionaries for this newly conquered land. While McKinley's implementation of Manifest Destiny inspired the philosopher William James to seed the idea of national service in America's conscience, the Peace Corps germinated as a reaction against this form of imperialism. In 1906, James joined Mark Twain, Andrew Carnegie, and other famous Americans in opposing U.S. empire by proposing to harness the visceral impulse to conquest for more noble ends. James characterized humanitarian assistance to foreign nations as, quote, the moral equivalent of war, or a counterbalance to the emotional intensity generated by the pursuit of empire. America's, quote-unquote, gilded youths needed such a program, quote, to get the childishness knocked out of them. As Protestant nations flooded the Philippines and China to teach and evangelize, James offered an alternative, secular vision, which Kennedy would implement in 1961. The idea of national service thus formed in opposition to, rather than imitation of, Christian imperialism, and Kennedy carefully avoided any proselytizing by the Peace Corps volunteers. Assuming office at the height of U.S. competition with officially atheist communist governments in the Cold War, John Kennedy paid rhetorical deference to this religious vision in his 1961 inaugural address by saying, "The same revolutionary beliefs for which our forefathers fought are still at issue around the globe. The belief that the rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God." And this is John Kennedy. This is not George W. Bush. The rights of man come not from the generosity of the state, but from the hand of God. Yet Kennedy's 1960 campaign for president inspired a general reaction against religion in politics. Many Protestants demanded that the Catholic Kennedy pledge support for an absolute separation of church and state. Liberal Protestants particularly feared that Kennedy's church would pressure him to follow the example of another Irish Catholic politician, Senator Joseph R. McCarthy, and wage a holy war against communists who suppressed religious freedom. After winning a narrow victory amid disputed results in Illinois and Texas, therefore, Kennedy proved extremely careful not to favor his church upon becoming the nation's first Catholic president. While he did appoint a Catholic, his brother-in-law Sergeant Schreiber, as the Peace Corps' first director, both men took excruciating care to avoid pro-Catholic or any religious proselytizing by volunteers. When some American missionaries in Nigeria proposed that the Peace Corps send Catholic volunteers to Catholic schools and Protestant volunteers to Protestant schools, Schreiber insisted that religion should not have any role in the placement of volunteers. Then soon after this incident, Schreiber's staff prepared a document entitled The Religious Policies of the Peace Corps, which prescribed volunteer participation in evangelization. So this was off limits. Kennedy and Schreiber agreed that the organization should operate with strict boundaries between church and state. If the Peace Corps did not promote Christian imperialism abroad, neither did this organization's volunteers serve as agents of an empire seeking to spread democracy overseas. President Woodrow Wilson, after earning a PhD and rising to the presidency of Princeton University, used the Oval Office to export political reform throughout the Western Hemisphere. "I intend to teach Latin Americans to elect good people," Wilson said, while proceeding to intervene with U.S. troops in Mexico, Haiti, Santo Domingo, and Cuba. Wilson's decision to fight in World War I derived from a stated goal to make the world safe for democracy. Now, by contrast, Peace Corps volunteers did not fight against anti-democratic governments, nor did they discourage or encourage democratic values. More than 50% of volunteers served as teachers. The other half worked in agriculture, small business development, and healthcare. Peace Corps volunteers stayed at the pleasure of the foreign government which had invited them. If an authoritarian government did not approve of the volunteers' method, the Peace Corps might be expelled. African rulers in particular asked the volunteers to focus on education. Yet when Ghana's leader, Kwame Nkrumah, perceived democratic lessons being taught in 1963, he banned volunteers from teaching English and history. Apparently, Nkrumah's fears derived from reports that Americans used George Orwell's Animal Farm, which allegorically criticized communist revolution by using authoritarian pigs to represent Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, among others. While today's Peace Corps volunteers do work with nonprofit corporations that seek to teach the principles and practice of democratic governments, such a project was not an official part of the 1960s Peace Corps. However, did the Peace Corps unofficially, or perhaps unintentionally, promote democracy in host nations? While few assessment techniques exist to determine the Peace Corps' effect, volunteers could only rely on anecdotal evidence. When Nkrumah's government lost popular support in 1965, protesters did hold signs saying, "No more Animal Farm." So apparently the Peace Corps lessons in English literature did have some significant political impact. Peru's current president, Alejandro Toledo, has credited Peace Corps volunteers with his decision to study in the United States, and when he returned after a presidential victory which restored democracy in that country, after the previous president had manipulated the Constitution and the media to preserve his personal rule, Toledo invited the Peace Corps back to the country. It had been expelled 30 years previous. So this story supports the idea that perhaps volunteers did spread democratic values abroad. But there are counterexamples. Some volunteers wondered if they had trained future dictators, that rather than creating conditions for a flourishing multi-party state. Upon hearing that a brutal Liberian dictator had sought to visit a Peace Corps volunteer who had taught him in grammar school, one volunteer sarcastically mocked the organization's ability to transfer democratic values. He said, quote, "Yes, maybe one of your students will grow up to disembowel a president and line up ministers on the beach to be shot." So rather than promoting democracy, some volunteers unwittingly perhaps provided basic skills to these oppressive rulers. Kennedy and Johnson did not seek to support or export Christian or democratic values to the Peace Corps, but they did hope that this organization would reform the social and the economic order of foreign nations along American models. Thus, the Peace Corps perpetuated an American tendency to implement non-military means of promoting American imperialism. This idea had roots in 20th century U.S. competition with European empires and an expanding Japan. After World War I, American leaders sought economic and diplomatic means of spreading U.S. hegemony. Military intervention in Latin America, motivated by fear of German or British power in the Western Hemisphere, had generated widespread resentment of Yankee imperialism. The need to shore up alliances in America's quote-unquote neighborhood encouraged U.S. leaders to replace military with financial and political methods. While America had not abandoned the Monroe Doctrine, which prohibited European countries from imposing their will in the Americas, U.S. presidents now pursued the same ends with a diplomatic approach. For example, President Franklin D. Roosevelt extended a $20 million loan to Brazil for a steel plant in the 1930s. Other precedents for the Peace Corps came from World War II and the Cold War, which allowed American presidents to extend a global empire through both non-military and coercive methods, while claiming to resist German, Japanese, and Soviet imperialism. Unspeakable wartime atrocities and unchecked aggression by German and Japanese governments justified this anti-imperialist imperialism, which led to the creation of unprecedented destructive technology in the United States during the Second World War. In fact, the fear of nuclear war encouraged Cold War leaders to avoid military confrontation, which might escalate to the point of mutually assured destruction. As the physicist Albert Einstein warned, if there's a World War III with nuclear weapons, the Fourth World War will be fought with sticks and stones. So as a result, Presidents Harry S. Truman and Dwight D. Eisenhower initiated foreign aid programs as a non-military means of containing communism. Foreign aid first appeared as a stated tool of U.S. policy in President Truman's 1949 inaugural address. Outlining 4 standards of U.S. action overseas, the fourth and final point pledged economic aid to the world's, quote, underdeveloped areas as a gesture of goodwill and, of course, to combat the appeal of communism. Truman nonetheless proved willing to send U.S. troops when communist North Korea invaded a U.S. client state in the South. And President Eisenhower initiated a Food for Peace program, which offered more than $12 billion in surplus farm goods to foreign nations. Yet Eisenhower's covert use of the Central Intelligence Agency also resulted in the overthrow of governments in Guatemala and Iran during the 1950s. So humanitarian aid clearly did not inhibit the United States from employing raw imperial power. Now, John Kennedy viewed the Peace Corps as a more effective means of associating U.S. empire with sacrifice rather than domination. Arriving at the University of Michigan at 2 a.m. on a cold October morning, Kennedy issued rhetorical questions which called young Americans to global leadership. Now, this is where I may slip into the Kennedy accent a little bit, but with the inspiration. How many of you are willing to spend 10 years in Africa or Latin America working for the United States and working for freedom? Kennedy proposes probably some arm cutting here also. He's probably chopping it with his hand. Kennedy's proposal of a decade overseas, which is 5 times more than Peace Corps volunteers would eventually require, might have seemed shocking for such a parochial nation as the United States, where even today only 20% of Americans own a passport. Yet Kennedy did not qualify these remarks, and he continued in more specific terms. How many of you are going to be doctors, willing to spend your days in Ghana? Kennedy's challenge to Americans to accept responsibility for American empire. While Britons had proven willing to spend 40 years in India and Africa in pursuit of empire, World War II had ended England's hold over a vast colony or vast network of global possessions on which the sun never set. Kennedy presented the Peace Corps as a means of countering the potential for complacency which had weakened England in the 1930s. The Peace Corps provided Kennedy with the means of attacking apathy about America's imperial responsibilities to promote socio-economic change abroad. Several years earlier, in his Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Why England Slept, Kennedy explained England's inability to resist German aggression in the 1930s by arguing that citizens of democratic governments can become complacent in the face of global challenges. Several social scientists in the 1950s similarly posited that materialism threatened America's leadership role in the Cold War. American abundance had unintentionally burdened the United States with a bureaucratic approach to foreign policy, in which U.S. diplomats failed to understand the social and economic problems underlying the undemocratic political systems in many countries. So that Americans had started to look at the third world and say, why can't they just get their act together? Why can't they just establish a democracy and behave responsibly? And not recognizing some of the social and economic roots of these problems. So in order to call attention to this phenomenon, Kennedy and several other politicians distributed a novel, which you may have heard of, The Ugly American, to each senator in January 1959. The book scathingly criticized U.S. Department of State officials in a Southeast Asian nation very similar to Vietnam. Yet The Ugly American also offered heroes, ordinary Americans who learned local languages, ate native foods, discovered inexpensive and innovative solutions to problems. This kind of frontier spirit existed in Americans, although not in U.S. officials abroad. That was the distinction he made, is that ordinary Americans had this spirit. One Asian character optimistically posited that, quote, average Americans are the best ambassadors a country can have. And another counseled that everyday American citizens could, quote, drive the communists out of Asia in a few years. As a book of the month club selection, which went through 55 printings in 2 years, The Ugly American entered the vocabulary as a lasting symbol of U.S. arrogance abroad. Yet this positive portrayal of Americans' potential for goodness helped inspire Kennedy to implement the Peace Corps as a means of exporting American society and culture. Nearly 70 years after historian Frederick Jackson Turner had declared the end of the frontier in American history, Kennedy sent Americans abroad to extend U.S. power more effectively as part of this new frontier theme of his presidency. Now, Kennedy's Vietnam policy revealed how the president envisioned socioeconomic change as a means of promoting U.S. empire. Countries that resisted overtures such as the Peace Corps faced more aggressive, even military means of extending American imperialism. In 1956, Senator Kennedy called for, quote, a political, economic, and social revolution far superior to anything the communists can offer in Vietnam. In an initiative known as Project Camelot, Kennedy's Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, it's kind of a futuristic idea, he envisioned a computer simulation of Vietnamese society, a computer simulation that would be used to make improvements, presumably on the American model. Describing chemists and physicists as critical in the First and Second World Wars, McNamara portrayed the Cold War in the Third World as the social scientists' war. So the social scientists now would take the lead in this new type of war. In this new struggle, Kennedy recruited experts from the Charles River School of Economists from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Harvard University. These academics disagreed, perhaps, about whether Karl Marx Material Conditions or the Protestant Work Ethic by Max Weber best promoted social equality, economic growth, and political freedom. But despite these uncertainties, Charles River School leader Walt Rostow agreed that the United States should export capitalism and democracy, and Vietnam served, quote, as a clear testing ground for our policy in the world. Now, President Lyndon Johnson continued this policy of ensuring the Peace Corps supported U.S. imperial ambitions. When volunteers threatened to oppose the military side of American empire, Johnson showed no tolerance. In 1965, Johnson sent the Marines to defend the Dominican Republic's military government against a rebellion seeking to restore the nation's exiled president to power. When some Peace Corps volunteers prepared a letter, and this letter would be sent to Johnson to protest Johnson's use of force, Frank Mankiewicz, the first director of the Peace Corps operation in Peru, pointedly advised them against letting their sentiments become public. If Johnson discovered the letter, Mankiewicz warned, the president would expel them from the Dominican Republic. So the volunteers followed Mankiewicz's advice. They remained in the country. They suppressed their ideas. And this comes about because Johnson feels so secure about the justness of his cause. It's this same faith in the goodness of American empire that leads Johnson to offer high aspirations for the country's goals in Vietnam. Now, these quotations are quite striking, I think. Rather than limit U.S. policy to the containment of communism, especially in this idea that the United States could be an empire through socioeconomic change. Johnson talked about remaking Vietnam's economy in America's image. Johnson says, I want to leave the footprints of America in Vietnam. I want them to say, this is Johnson now, I want them to say, this is what America left. Schools and hospitals and dams. He's talking about much more than containment of communism here. He's talking about transplanting American society and economic system in Vietnam. Rather than merely seeking to defeat aggression, Johnson believed that the United States should help that country win, quote, win victory over hunger, disease, and despair. So this is a war on poverty for Vietnam. Johnson promised public works for Vietnam, such as a Tennessee Valley Authority project in the Mekong Delta. In Johnson's mind, the idea of empire had few limits. So in conclusion, did the Peace Corps promote U.S. empire? I argue that the Peace Corps volunteers were not religious missionaries who sought to spread Christian values. If individual volunteers harbored such intentions, the Peace Corps leadership discouraged it. Neither did volunteers seek to instruct foreign nationals in a particular political model. If volunteers did encourage democracy, it was largely unintentional. However, volunteers did propagate the idea that Americans could and should share their superior social, financial, and technological skills with the world. In the words of historian Elizabeth Hoffman Cobbs, Peace Corps, quote, Peace Corps was Kennedy's way of saying, know that our ultimate intent is social justice, even if we make mistakes getting there. Thus, as many scholars have said at this conference, the United States empire came with purity of intentions. But with what consequences? The Peace Corps presented American power as benevolent. Kennedy, and especially Johnson, expressed such confidence in the positive potential of U.S. power that some have called this policy, quote-unquote, welfare imperialism. Somebody has said the United States wants to be less the world's policeman than the world's nanny, which maybe goes a little bit far. But the justification, therefore, of America's socioeconomic supremacy, similar to Manifest Destiny and similar to democratization in earlier periods, allowed Kennedy and Johnson to justify military force to achieve the same goals. Thank you.
Well, I want to thank all the prior speakers, but in particular Tom and Cy for introducing the topic of foreign aid, because that's my topic this morning. And I think I have a very different take on how foreign aid is constructed and what the motivations are for it. And I think it may be somewhat surprising for you, or perhaps not. It's been alluded to, but I think there's a more deliberate case to be made for foreign aid as an outgrowth of domestic economic interests in the United States. And in the interest of full disclosure, I will say that I worked in the foreign aid establishment for about 5 years between my master's and my PhD. I worked for the U.S. Agency for International Development in Washington and in Zaire, and then I also worked for a non-profit organization called Oxfam America in West Africa for several years. I lived in Senegal for one of those years. So, I went back to school when I did my PhD thinking a lot about foreign aid and what's wrong with foreign aid and why foreign aid policy is made as it is. So today my topic is this: U.S. foreign aid in the Cold War era, building security, building trade, or building empire. And I asked the question, was the growth of U.S. power in the international system during the Cold War an intentional grab for empire, and foreign aid was one part of that grab, or was it something much more based on American economic interests and, of course, security interests? My argument is based on the fundamental proposition that the U.S. was not intentionally in the business of building an empire. Rather, the U.S. foreign policy and foreign aid policy was based on pursuing national security goals, clearly, building alliances, thwarting communism, but also built on domestic economic objectives, that there were important economic actors in the United States who had something to gain by promoting foreign aid. At the same time, and I think equally important, is the fact that foreign policy goals have been misperceived and misinterpreted such that foreign aid was depicted as a humanitarian program, something good for the world. A lot of the emphasis was on its humanitarian mission. And when the foreign aid program failed to live up to that mission in many parts of the world, and did emphasize the security goals and the economic goals instead of a humanitarian mission, it became seen as empire building. And that's my overall message, is that because it was cloaked in this kind of humanitarian rhetoric, which wasn't actually what was driving the foreign aid program, when it's revealed that it's not doing what it's saying it's going to do, it's being perceived by people around the world as being empire building, when in fact I don't believe that was the original goal of the program. Okay, so, well, the foreign aid program had its roots in the, I'm going to try to skip through the history because I know we're short on time. The foreign aid program had its roots in the in World War II, in the Lend-Lease program, and in, of course, the Marshall Plan, which we've heard quite a bit about this morning. Cordell Hull was the Secretary of State from 1933 to 1945, and he was the first one that I know talked a lot about peace and prosperity going hand in hand, and increasing security and economic prosperity for the United States, I mean, not for the rest of the world, at the same time. The thing that we missed about the Marshall Plan was how the Marshall Plan was an outgrowth of U.S. economic need in the United States. For example, when the Bretton Woods Conference convened in 1944, the American economic advantages relative to its trading partners were just enormous. You know, Europe was shattered and the United States had grown. Industrial production in the United States was double that of the pre-war years, and so the United States had a lot to get rid of, to put it bluntly. The Marshall Plan answered the need to get rid of, let's see, at the end of World War II, I think it was, I have the data here, 68, in 1945, the U.S. produced half of the world's coal, 2/3 of the world's oil, and more than half of the world's electricity. And the U.S. held 80% of the world's gold reserves. So we have a lot of potential. And there's a fear that there's no place to sell this and no country to trade with. So we have every incentive to help rebuild Europe, an economic incentive to rebuild Europe. The other important thing about this is that at the time, Americans were very fearful of a post-war depression. They've been through it once in recent past and at this time. And 68% of Americans polled in 1945 said they considered unemployment to be the single greatest post-war issue. 80% of the American Economic Association at the time polled said that they predicted a post-war depression. So there's great economic imperative in the United States to do something about the danger, the economic perils facing us at the end of the war, and to create more out of the economic opportunities that we have based on our own production. The Marshall Plan is also a huge investment for the United States. 16% of the federal budget during 4 years was devoted to the Marshall Plan. I mean, that's tantamount to defense today. I mean, it's an enormous program. And to keep that in perspective, you can think about the fact that the foreign aid program today is typically about 1% of the budget. So it was really an enormous investment. And I believe an investment in Europe, but also an investment in ourselves, because we needed countries to trade with and other places to do business. Well, I don't want to overemphasize the economic issues. I want to talk about them, two things primarily that I believe foreign aid was based on: building security and building our domestic economy, right? Although it has been frequently discussed with regard to its humanitarian nature, the foreign aid program had the national interest at its core. The idea was to cement alliances, to lure countries into the U.S. sphere of influence, and to entice countries to undertake the kind of reforms that we favored: democratic reforms, market reforms, and so forth. One indication of the mission of aid is to look at who received foreign aid. And in this, we can see that it wasn't the poorest countries, clearly, during the Cold War that received aid, but alliance countries, countries that were important to the American security goals: Israel, Egypt, Turkey, Greece. And, you know, there's a top 10 list that varies a little bit, but those four are always on the list. And of course, these are countries that we have important relationships with, and countries perhaps that even have need, but they're not the poorest of the poor. U.S. allies during the Johnson administration, the top aid countries were Egypt, Pakistan, South Korea, Turkey, Vietnam, and Cambodia. And we have to say something about aid in the Vietnam War here. foreign aid was used to fund the Vietnam War to a great extent. 20% of the U.S. Vietnam War military budget in the 1970s came from aid and food aid sales to Vietnam. As congressional approval for funding for U.S. involvement in war fell, so as Congress is giving away less money for the war-fighting budget, they're giving more money through the food aid budget and the economic aid budget as a way to help keep U.S. funding for Vietnam. And in 1974 alone, about half of the entire food aid program was sent to Vietnam. I mean, this was such an important goal of our national security goal, or whatever you want to make of it. It was such an important element that we sent half of the food aid just to Vietnam. After the Vietnam War, though, Congress rethought it. Congress asked for, or demanded, that aid policymakers think more about the humanitarian goals of aid. In fact, they imposed something called the 75-25% split, which said that 75% of the aid has to go to the poorer countries and 25% to the richer countries, or, that's more discretionary, that 25%. The interesting thing was what happened at that point was that the aid budget increased, right? Because in order to continue to send enough money to our strategic allies, you have to have more money in the program. In a memo to National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft in 1975, NSC staffers wrote this. Because of the congressional requirement of a 75-25 split between poorer and high-income countries, it's necessary to ship additional amounts to low-income countries, India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, in order to meet the high priority requirements to the politically important countries, like China, it says Chile and Korea, in parentheses. It also was, it's just impossible to talk about the foreign aid program without talking about aid for Israel, because Israel has been at the top of the list for decades. And to some people, this is considered a perversion of the program because Israel is not a country with, substantial poverty. Others consider this to be rational use of foreign aid to build alliances and to promote stability in a democratic country in the Middle East. And heaven knows we want to support democracy in the Middle East. In a 1990 book, A.J.F. Organsky argued that aid to Israel is, and this is the title of the book, the $36 billion bargain, because he thinks it's a worthwhile use of funding. Other people have said, it's not a bargain, it's a ripoff. But no matter how you fall on that question, the reality is that aid is based on security concerns and not need if you're giving such a large portion of it to Israel. Other countries have come and gone on this top 10 list of foreign aid recipients. Today, Iraq and Afghanistan are there. 10 years ago, Bosnia was there and Russia was there. Peru and Colombia come up, through the war on drugs. There was very important aid recipients. And so I just wanted to point out throughout the Cold War, it's been a clear pattern of giving aid to countries where we have important security concerns. Speaking about aid in 1954, and this is a long history of this, and I'll wrap up the security section here, Hubert Humphrey summed up these security goals of aid. He said, "We've got to look upon America's food abundance not as a liability, but as an asset. Wise statesmanship and leadership can convert these surpluses into a great asset for checking communist aggression. Communism has no greater ally than hunger, and democracy and freedom have no greater ally than an abundance of food." So, okay, let's accept, I think easily accepted, that aid is based on security objectives. Now, a little tougher case to make, aid is based on American domestic economic interests. Although the U.S. aid program has been presented to the outside world as charity, I think it's very clear if you look at foreign aid for any length of time that charity begins at home. The U.S., you can divide this into several categories, and the first category that's cited is market development aid. And what we mean by that is we gave foreign aid during the Cold War to develop markets. Obviously, the Marshall Plan is the first great example of that. We rebuild Europe so we can sell them things. But this continues on, and there has been a fair amount of research linking trade and aid in such that, you can do regression analysis. I've done it. McKinley and Little have done it. If you give aid, then 5 years later, the trade relationship grows. So it's sort of what they call a graduation process, and they use countries like South Korea and Taiwan to look at particularly the growth of countries that graduate from being aid recipients to now being trade partners. In fact, USAID noted in a 1992 report that 43 of the 50 countries that bought the most agricultural commodities from the United States. So these are our largest consumers of American food today, were once food aid recipients. So in some ways it's very self-serving to have aid given to these countries who then become trade partners. A second way in which aid promotes U.S. economic interests is even more direct, and that's because the money is spent here in the United States. 75% of all the aid budget is spent right here on American goods and services through sometimes rather lucrative contracts, and I mean mostly with farmers, pharmaceutical companies, vehicle companies, transportation companies, and the like. The aid administrator noted in 1995 that 84 cents on every aid dollar is used to purchase American goods and services. So, the U.S. aid publication put it this way: most foreign economic assistance over the years has consisted of food, equipment, training, expert services, heavy machinery, and technology. Most of these have come from American farms, American factories, universities, and research institutes. Thus, the benefits are reaped by developing nations, but the money ends up in U.S. pockets. That's a report. The astonishing thing is that aid is so critiqued in the United States because, in fact, it's been such a benefit to us and potentially to the recipient countries. Some politicians have even built a career on criticizing foreign aid, and I refer especially to Senator Jesse Helms, who was forever criticizing foreign aid. He said once that it goes down foreign rat holes, and I think the most controversial one. And the irony is that in the year he said that, his home state of North Carolina received $400 million in aid contracts, because of goods and services and things that were purchased in North Carolina to be sent down, quote-unquote, foreign rat holes. The most clear economic actors who benefit from the foreign aid program are American farmers, and that's true through the Cold War, less true today. Food aid was used to moderate the farm economy throughout the Cold War, disposing of surpluses, getting rid of stocks, stocks that were purchased by the U.S. government and held and expensive to contain. They could be disposed of through the food aid program. Food aid is also used to stabilize commodity prices and to reduce, and could be lowered in years when there wasn't much food produced or not such enormous surpluses produced. In the period from 1955 to 1991, U.S. food aid accounted for 17% of U.S. wheat production. So 17% of what was produced was sent as food aid, and that's 34% of total exports. Rice was enormously dependent on food aid throughout Vietnam, of course, and then even after. 30% of rice exports are purchased by the United States and distributed overseas as food aid in the Cold War period. Another bit of evidence that farmers reap profits from food aid and that it isn't humanitarian based is that through the 1970s, from the 1950s to the 1970s, non-food items were transferred as part of the food aid program, including cotton and tobacco. Congress, finally did outlaw the use of tobacco as food aid, but that was clearly a benefit to North Carolina, not to the recipients. The other important factor, and there's sort of normative arguments about whether this is good for the recipients, not good for the recipients. Can you help your people at home while helping your people overseas? And I think that the literature is very mixed on that. There is clear that when food aid arrives in a country and they don't and undercuts local production, it can be a real problem, for people who are the local farmers. But there have been cases where food aid was good for the recipient country and good for the country that gave it. One bit of anecdotal evidence before I conclude comes from the Vietnam War. Actually after the Vietnam War, because the rice producers of America had really gotten a lot of rice sent overseas during Vietnam, and it was very beneficial to them. And a lot of this comes from the Ford archives, where I've done some research in Ann Arbor. In 1976, when the war was over and the rice shipments aren't going to Vietnam anymore, the rice farmers basically launched a full-out assault on the administration to get rice out of America and into food aid programs. And it was so important that they were choosing recipients based on, who would take the rice. And they set up programs in Portugal and in Egypt and in Indonesia. And State Department was really scrambling to find a place to get rid of the rice, which is kind of a sort of tail wagging the dog phenomenon. You think about it the other way around, typically. Congressman Passman led the charge. He was from Louisiana, a very senior member of Congress at the time. And, they grow a lot of rice in Louisiana. And he even threatened the NSC in a memo I read. He said, for every $1 of rice you cut from the PL 480 budget, that's the food aid budget, he could find $2 to cut from the foreign military budget. So he was really saying, let's get the rice out of the country. And in a memo reporting on a meeting of the Interagency Group on Food Aid Policy, one of the members of the President's Council of Economic Advisors wrote the following. It just gives you a sense of how they think about food aid. Agriculture is anxious to move milk and rice. They view these commodities as essentially throwaways, he writes. Neither state nor NSC really want either. In the case of rice, there appears to be serious questions about whether we can move up to 1 million tons by the end of this fiscal year. To move rice requires a sizable Korea program, since they're about the only ones who want it. So it's really a sense of, we need to get this rice out of here. Let's get friendly with Korea to get rid of it. It's just interesting to me. The humanitarian goals of foreign aid have been overstated, I think it's safe to say. I mean, most Americans don't perceive this kind of self-interested foreign aid. And as I say, it may be possible that you can do both things at one time. It doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't also helping people. But primarily during the Cold War, the objectives were very much America-based. Countless sources employing a range of statistical analyses and anecdotal evidence and archival evidence demonstrate that the U.S. economic assistance program was not based on recipient need during the Cold War. So the question remains, did the U.S. establish and develop a food aid program as part of a program to build an empire? I really don't think so. I don't think we intentionally said, let's go out and build an empire. I think it was more a sense of being driven by domestic actors who need us to do things to keep the world safe and to promote our economic interests. So while the U.S. was not deliberately pursuing empire through foreign aid, I think the tendency to make humanitarian claims about aid while pursuing self-interested goals aroused a lot of suspicions about American motivations overseas. In some cases, the U.S. was perceived as imperialist by foreign countries who felt that the U.S. aid program really wasn't doing anything to alleviate their poverty, and so they began to question the motives of the aid program. In some cases, the U.S. aid was perceived as a way of co-opting leaders, as a way of propping up corrupt autocrats. If you don't see it making you feel better off, perhaps you see it as propping up someone corrupt. I mentioned I worked in Zaire. In 1983, I spent most of the year in Zaire, and at that time, aid was being used to support Mobutu, a tyrannical leader, a man who was, just a dreadful leader of this African nation and did nothing to help the terrible suffering of his people. And we had a close alliance with Mobutu, primarily because he was next to Angola, which had a communist-backed government, and we wanted to make sure he was in our camp. The U.S. believed that our program was funding a staunch anti-communist and a stable leader, Mobutu, and that was an important goal for us. But our support of this regime made many people in Zaire critical of the U.S. and very suspicious of our involvement in that country. And I think this phenomenon of saying one thing, acting another way, and therefore the rest of the world wondering what we're really trying to do, it could be multiplied many times throughout the Cold War. So although Americans usually associate foreign aid with its humanitarian objectives, it's clear that during the Cold War years, we were motivated by domestic economic objectives and national security goals. To a great extent, the development of a large-scale foreign aid program in the Cold War was more about answering the demands of domestic interest groups than it was about creating any kind of deliberate empire abroad. The humanitarian rhetoric which was used to describe aid programs during the Cold War masked its true objectives and then contributed to international perceptions of the U.S. as an imperial power. Thank you. Questions? I don't know, Cleves, what do you think? We've gone way over this morning, haven't we?
Is there a really urgent question? Otherwise, if there's not, I suggest we move along right now. But thank you very much, Polly. Thank you all for very provocative, very interesting, and insightful talks. We will now conclude this panel, and the next panel will begin at 11 o'clock in about 17 minutes. Thank you very much.